This is What If I Told You, the event psychology video podcast for event professionals in which Victoria Leidy, event consultant and host, talks with the world's top minds in behavioral science, neuroscience, and psychology on how to transform events using insights about human behavior and mind. For more science-based tips, join Event Psychology Club at eventpsychology.gumroad.com. Also, check out Victoria's online course, Event Psychology Lab, at eventpsychology.thinkific.com, which covers key behavioral science concepts and offers research-backed solutions to your event challenges. This course is a unique opportunity to upgrade your industry skills and gain a competitive edge without adding to your already busy schedule. Now, enjoy the conversation.
Hello, I'm Victoria Leidy, and this is What If I Told You, the event psychology podcast where I talk all things event psychology, that is how to apply brain science insights in events. Today, my guest is Leidy Klotz, who studies the science of design, which, he reminds us, is something we all do every day. His research has appeared in both Nature and Science, and his debut popular science book, Subtract, is among the most influential, published in 2021, and is already on all-time reading lists for both design and behavioral science. A professor at the University of Virginia, Leidy is a frequent guest on interview programs, including Hidden Brain, Freakonomics, NPR, and For the Atlantic. His writing has appeared in outlets such as the Washington Post, Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, and Scientific American. He is a sought-after speaker, having given more than 100 invited talks at leading universities, think tanks, and companies. Leidy, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Victoria. This will be fun.
Yeah, it was, I think it was about 2 years ago when I first heard you speak on some other podcast. And I feel like our conversation is long overdue because ever since then, I started consciously noticing how much we prefer to add rather than to subtract. And I'm very excited to be able to discuss it with you today. So my first question is, can you explain the concept of subtraction and what your research on that revealed?
Yeah, I guess the easiest way is to start with this story. And it's been described as an apocryphal story, but I had to look up what apocryphal means, and that means it's made up. And I was like, no, this isn't a made up, this is true. But I was playing Legos with my son, and since this is being recorded, I've got a replica here. So basically, we had this problem: we're making a bridge out of Duplos. He was 3 at the time, and it wasn't level. And so I went to solve this problem by adding a block to the shorter column of the bridge. And before I could do that, he had removed a block from the longer column. And it's a really simple example, but it illustrates in a really physical way what the core finding here is that when we think about trying to make something better, in this case, it was a bridge, but in the case of your listeners, it's an event. Why do our first thought is, hey, what can we add to make this thing better? And that's not necessarily a problem. The problem is when we subsequently don't consider this whole other class of options, which is taking away from what's already there. And so basically, the bridge obviously wasn't the entire program of research, but it inspired a whole bunch of research. And if you think about I like to think about the research in terms of physical things, that we're trying to make better, also ideas that we're trying to make better, or thoughts that we're trying to make better, and then the situations that we're trying to make better, and that might be the event. And across all of those contexts, our research shows we have the same basic tendency, which is, hey, what can we add? And then sometimes we will add and move on without considering whether subtraction might have been a better option, even in cases when it is objectively the better option.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I can certainly say that in events, the default to improvement is almost always to add more features, more sessions to the program, make things, longer, bigger, and so on. And, I believe that less is more has been overlooked for years. I remember that, a few years ago, I discussed it with a client how to improve the event program. And I suggested to reduce the length of a session from 1.5 hours to 45 minutes. To me, both numbers are crazy still, but at the time, it took me so much time to convince them that it's better to reduce it. And I know that for many event professionals, it took, a lot of time in the pandemic to realize that more is not always a better choice. And I wonder if you have any suggestions for event professionals who want to start, applying this less is more thinking, and where do we start with this?
Yeah, I mean, first, I'm sympathetic because it totally makes sense, that feeling, right? So, I mean, the first step is to think about subtraction, right? And that's what we're hopefully doing here. That's what we hopefully did with the book. That's what you're saying you felt the last 2 years after kind of hearing about the idea, is like, okay, this is something I'm overlooking. And if you can put in place reminders, just, hey, we're planning the event, we're considering this session, how do we make this session better? Let's at least think about whether a 45-minute session might be better than an 1.5-hour session. So that's step one, is to think about it. Then the second step is how do you overcome this desire to show competence, right? And it's just, I'm not an event professional, but I go to a lot of these events, and I organize some in the academic arena, and it really makes sense, right? You're being hired to make this event, or your name is behind this event, and you're going to say, oh, actually, we're only going to have a 45-minute session instead of an 1.5-hour session. And, maybe the 1.5-hour session won't be as powerful as the 45-minute session, but at least people won't say, well, Victoria didn't try very hard in making this event, or, hey, maybe they just couldn't find anything to do for that 45 minutes, and that's why we're not doing anything. And this is one of the things I found in the research for the book was, after we find, okay, people don't think of subtraction, you think, well, why might this be? And, you start with biology and what's helped us evolve and pass down our genes over time. And, certainly we have adding, one explanation for our adding could be that acquiring food and those types of things has helped us over time. But then another more surprising one is this desire to display competence, to show that we can effectively interact with the world. And so the example I use in the book is, and it's a fun example, is the bowerbirds that go around, and the male birds build nests, and the female birds go look at the male's nests to see which male to mate with. And then the females go and build a nest to raise the young. So the whole point of the male-built nest is just to show that this bird can effectively interact with the world. They can make change in their world. And that's something that's since been extended to task completion, right? One way that we display competence is by completion of tasks. And when I check an item off my to-do list, that's like scratching that itch to display competence. And when I think about the times that I struggle to cut things back, it's often because I'm worried about displaying competence, right? Because if you add something, the evidence is there that you can effectively interact with the world. If you subtract something, you run the risk of, people not necessarily noticing that you've done it. And I just to flip it back to that, 1.5-hour to 45-minute session example, it's like, are there ways that you can do the 45-minute session, but also indicate to your audience, whether explicitly or in some kind of hidden way, that, yeah, we thought about this is a thoughtful decision, and here's the reason behind it, and here's why it makes sense, and then make the subtraction noticeable. Then that's, just displaying your competence. So yeah, I don't know. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I find that explaining the reasoning behind the decisions that might otherwise seem kind of strange to the audience is one of the best ways to go around it. And I mean, that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
And there's a neat example just in presentations, right? I mean, the revolution brought about by TED, and everybody's like, oh, look, you can do a 20-minute presentation and that it's actually interesting and people remember it better instead of an hour-long presentation. And, that still hasn't, if you try to do a 20-minute talk in academia, people are going to say, like, what's wrong with you? Even though the science is all the same, right? Academics are no different. They're falling asleep after 55 minutes the same way a regular audience is. But one way to get around that and still show the competence is you can do a shorter talk. You can do better slides where you don't have all the text and 80 million bullet points. You just give people a handout. It's like, here's the work, right? I still did all the long, boring slide presentation, and you can look at it if you want, but I'm going to give a talk that you might actually have a chance of remembering. So that's an example of kind of thinking about how to display competence while also subtracting. I think another one is just how when you think about things that have been really stripped down, a cliche example is just kind of the Apple products, right? Nobody's wondering whether Steve Jobs didn't think to add this feature on the iPhone. It's like, no, they're intentionally making this streamlined. And I think you could think of a parallel to an event where, it's so stripped down that people are like, oh, this is deliberate. This is a intentionally streamlined event.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, the audience might be more understanding actually, but the challenge is to get the event professionals themselves, apply different thinking and apply less is more approach.
Yeah.
Right. Can you give any other example from your experience as an attendee or as a speaker, or even as you mentioned, you organized events where subtraction would make things better?
Yeah, for me, there are a whole bunch of subtractions that go into one overall subtraction, which I think is like breaking down the barrier. For me as a speaker, breaking down the barrier between the speaker and the audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, you can listen to me on a podcast, you can read the book. The whole point of me being at the event is to provide some kind of value beyond what you can get from those other mediums. And so if it's just a real shame when you just go up on stage, talk, and then there's no opportunity for interaction. And so kind of breaking down that audience speaker barrier, also breaking down the barrier between different attendees, right? You're learning as much from the different attendees as you are from the speakers. And I think some of the things that can be, some of the formality that can be subtracted there to help with that, right? This is funny. I spoke with Steve Levitt. He's the Freakonomics author on his podcast, and he came up with his examples of when subtraction made things better. And his example was his speaking agent told him to stop wearing a tie when he was speaking. And it was kind of like getting at this same thing. It was like, look, Steve, you're like going to talk. You don't need to, they already know who you are. You don't need to have a tie to impress them. And if you don't have the tie, they're going to be more receptive to your message. And kind of, it's going to break down this barrier between the speaker and the audience. And also like stepping out in front of the podium was another one. I think that he's, don't speak from notes, don't have a tie, and be out in front of the podium. And all of those were kind of getting rid of the podium, getting rid of the notes, getting rid of the tie. And I think also fundamentally getting rid of this barrier between the audience and the speaker. So that's my favorite one. And that's the one that I try to break down. And I think, more and more events are trying to do this. And, especially when you have the really unique opportunity to meet in person, right? We've been doing the pandemic with the virtual events for so long, and you get people together in person. It's like, well, let's do something that couldn't have been done on Zoom. So
absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's That's a great idea. Thank you for sharing. I think, it's a pretty thought-provoking idea, getting rid of this barrier and making sure that it's more authentic, more personal touch rather than just formal, speaking experience, for example, or hearing from a speaker. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. My other question is about your new book.
Okay.
I know that, yeah, it's upcoming, and it's going to be about our relationship with the physical space and how environment shapes our behavior and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally cannot be more excited about this because I think it's a fascinating topic we don't really talk about much, because, and it is super relevant for event professionals because, we organize events in some spaces. And I always thought that, we need to know more about how it affects us, how it affects our audiences, and how we can improve the physical space so that it works better for everyone. So can you tell more about this topic and your upcoming book?
I'll tell more, and then I want to hear an example from you of how you shape space to make the event better, because it ties in directly to the book, and I might use the example in the book too,
okay.
Or it might help me get an example. So there's two things going on with the book. One is exactly what you said, which is how environment makes our everything, right? Our actions, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions. And there's a lot of science behind that. And I hope that the book can help kind of heighten our appreciation for that, it's something we should be paying way more attention to. But then the other side of the book, which I think is the new part, is just how much we make our surroundings, right? I think we often think about this as something that professional engineers or professional architects or, a developer or or your wife or whoever it is the one who's in charge of the space, and you don't actually have any agency over making space. But in fact, we're the only ones who make space, right? I mean, if you an architect might have their ideas about what a space should be like, but the architect is always working for a client. Most spaces aren't designed by a professional architect, and there's some very basic psychology that we have that kind of determines how we make space. And so those are the kinds of things that I want to highlight in the book, I guess, is that cycle, right? The space makes us, and then we make the space, but the space makes us more than we think, and we make the space much more than we think. So I've got to work on the elevator pitch. I need to have some good catchy stories like the Legos with Ezra, but I'd be curious on, I can think of one of my event experiences, and then maybe hear one of yours. But so one of the speaking events I did was for a consulting company in Florida, and they had the event was in Florida, and they had everything set up like a really cool speaker system, and then like the lighting and everything, and the stage, and and then I went up there to speak after the person announced me. I didn't know they were going to do any of this stuff, and so the person announced me, and I went up to speak, and it was like the music like for a sports event, right? It was like, here comes Michael Jordan, and when I got up there and I looked at the audience, I was like, holy smokes, like this audience is in a totally different position than an audience that I normally would talk to in terms of like their eagerness to hear what I have to say. And nothing at all had changed about me or the words in the introduction. It was all just like, okay, they had dimmed the lights, they had put the spotlight on, they had the music, they had, worked on the surroundings, which just set up the talk in a totally different way. So I found that pretty powerful.
This is a great example, actually, and I find it engaging more senses produces better results, because we usually engage sense of vision naturally, and it's the primary probably primary sense. But when we've got more senses involved, and when we do that intentionally, then the experience is so much better. And music is so powerful, obviously. Right. I remember I read this story by Robert Cialdini. He says that at some event, he went on stage using Think by Aretha Franklin. And he asked organizers to put it, as his music signature tune when he goes up on stage, because he wanted to prime the audience for learning. And I found it very interesting, one of the ways to use music. And I also I also think that there are so many studies around how space affects us on a subconscious level. For example, that people naturally prefer round shapes rather than sharp objects.
Well, you've got the hot air balloon in your background there, right? It's
Yes.
I was just reading "Joyful" by Ingrid Fetterly. It's really cool synthesis of like how aesthetics kind of tie into our psychology. So and that also kind of amazed me at the time when I read about this research about round shapes versus sharp objects, is that people feel more comfortable naturally when they are surrounded by smooth lines. And, you can use that. For example, you can use a different type of furniture, to make your attendees feel more comfortable. And so all those kind of things that you intentionally use in your environment then kind of contribute to the overall feeling and to the outcomes, to the experience, the satisfaction with this experience. So that's some of the examples that come to mind right now. And also, I remember something I read about making the specific first impression. For example, how you decorate your entrance to the venue matters, right? Yes. Because this is the first impression that stays with people, and it sticks in people's memories. And so you need to make sure that you pay attention to how you do that. And what kind of feelings you want to evoke. It's a fun field too, because it's like some of this stuff is there. People come to it through scientific methods of, studying entrances and how people react and like, what are they remembering after the event, but then also just kind of ancient wisdom and the field of architecture, which is much more grounded in the humanities, but like architecture, they will say, focusing on the entrance, how people come into the space is one of the most important things for that very reason. So it's, it's interesting. And then even just the kind of functional interactions, right? The difference between an event where attendees are at tables and can talk to each other instantly versus have to rearrange their seats to get into groups. That makes all the difference if you're trying to get people to actually engage with the material and with each other. So.
Right. And what I like about it is that in most cases, it's small tweaks that you can apply that actually lead to bigger and better outcomes than you might think. That's a great example of that, I think. Right. And so I've got a couple of final questions. Okay. So one is, what would you say is the single one science insight that event professionals should apply immediately? Something that they don't do as much right now, and you would rather like them to do?
Build this into your process, right? Give yourself reminders and cues to subtract. So as simple. Every time you add something to an event, think about, okay, is there something that I could subtract? Like make that a rule. Or are there two things that I could subtract? And that will just get you past the not thinking of this option. And it will also, I think, empower you to that now subtraction is a way to show competence, right? It's like, hey, we are deliberately doing this. We've charged ourselves with doing it, and we are displaying competence by subtracting. So I think, but building it into the process is really important. I think this podcast will go a long way to helping people think about it. But once you get into the heat of the moment and you're planning the event, it helps to have those reminders there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, I mean, what would you recommend also in terms of how you convince others to subtract? I mean, you can say, oh, okay, I'm an event professional, and I actually, I read Leidy's book, and I want to do that. But how do I convince my colleagues to follow me?
Yeah, one of the subtracting obviously has like a negative valence, right? And so like when people have a reaction to it, it's not quite as bad as when they hear the word moist, but it's off-putting, and that's why nobody had used it as the title for a book yet. So I think you can think about synonyms, right? It's like, okay, Victoria, she didn't, subtract something from our event. She cleared away excess cognitive overload, or she removed the barrier between the audience and or she got rid of the barrier between the audience and the speaker. She, instead of saying that subtracted that barrier, you could say that you enhanced the connection, right? So just like looking for ways to flip around and focus on what you've added, and then if you want to focus on the subtraction, just using a synonym like clean or carve or reveal, things like that.
I love it. Yeah, it's a great suggestion. Yeah, like framing it a different way. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like even Marie Kondo, right? She's the guru of tidying, and her whole emphasis is on sparking joy. And so she's, if this thing isn't sparking joy, then get rid of it. And she's focusing on the joy that is provided by the tidy space, as opposed to the small little bit of, anxiety or loss or whatever you'll feel getting rid of the t-shirt that you haven't ever worn in the last 5 years.
Yeah. Right. And the final question, the signature question is, because the podcast title is What If I Told You, can you complete this sentence with one takeaway relevant to our conversation? So what if I told you?
I would say, what if I told you that we're overlooking one of the most basic ways to make things better?
That's a great line. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leidy, for joining me today. That was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I invite everyone to connect with Leidy on LinkedIn and check his book, of course. And I thank you for tuning in to What If I Told You, the Event Psychology podcast. I provide all the links from our conversation in the show notes. And for more brain science insight and for this episode recap, I invite you to join the Event Psychology Club. Also, if you want to upgrade your skills and get research-based solutions for your events, I invite you to take the Event Psychology online course that I created for event professionals like you. Thank you, Leidy, again, and until next time, bye-bye.
Thanks, Victoria.